Welcome to the Faces podcast. We're a Christian and Muslim charity working to build resilience in faith communities against child sexual exploitation and other forms of harm. We'll be talking about what faith and interfaith work means to us and how we embed an inclusive and authentic approach throughout our work.
Hello and welcome to our podcast today. And today, Melissa and I are going to be discussing the illegal immigration bill. And that's gone through the Commons twice and is now sitting with the House of Lords. And I sat and listened to a couple of hours of debate in the House of Lords online, thanks to the technology that they've got, and listened to some of the arguments on it. And that's something we want to discuss today. And I think it has big ramifications for much that's happening around people seeking asylum and refugees. And it's probably got some big implications for the country. And I think it's a really important thing for us as Faces to be discussing. It deals with young people and their vulnerability. And it deals with people moving countries and their vulnerabilities. But the assumption is that if you have a strong enough deterrent, people won't get in boats and cross to another country. And so if we make things really, really bad, no one will do that. And I think that might not be the case. And the bill, in trying to tackle that and send people to Rwanda or other countries in order to be assessed and all of that, if that ever happens, is something that's supposed to be this deterrent that stops people crossing in the first place. This kind of thing has been tried by Australia and other countries like that. And I think that's where some of it has been thought through. But there's international agreements that countries have signed up to. And the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees says the following: a person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to much such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, who, not having a nationality and being outside of the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable, or owing to much fear, is unwilling to return to it. And that's the definition of a refugee. And I think in some of the bill and some of how it's dealing with this, it's trying to separate people seeking asylum from refugees. It's trying to define things in certain ways, which is a current system we have now, but actually working that further. It has to do with people's legal right to enter the country and its definition of that, and what pathways they are that are legal to actually enter the country. There's no clear definition that I can see in this that works for the numbers that are around the world. Some of the key factors are some people speak English; they don't speak the countries of language of other nations. So some of the draw is English, but there's no way of addressing how people can legally come from somewhere like Sudan straight into the UK. And so because there's no legal passages or tiny little limited legal passages around the world, there's this kind of, it's an unreal thing for the weight of people movements that are happening in the world. One of the Lib Dem lords that was speaking, basically he described it as King Canute trying to hold back the tide, which he'd got from a paper he'd read. And he was saying, in some ways, isn't it better to work on the flow of water rather than trying to stop the tide? And so there's suggestions in some of the arguments coming from the House of Lords like that. And I think it'd be good for us to discuss this and the implications of the bill and some of those things. It hasn't been made law yet. It's still got to go through the Lords. But we're trying to have a look at the implications for that. Is it morally right to treat people like this? As a Christian, I'd say, there's this a whole load in the Bible about how you treat the sojourner, how you treat the person who's moving through your country, how you should treat them and how you should treat them right. I think this bill kind of does clash with that. It's almost treating them like a prisoner for coming into your country, rather than how we help these people, how we care for these people. And there's arguments that were in the House of Lords when I listened to it, saying basically, this isn't what we've been known for as a country. This changes something. So that's my initial delve into it. I don't know if you'd like to chip into that, Melissa.
Thanks, Nigel. Just thinking a lot as you're talking, starting with what you said about, excuse me, the bill being a deterrent for people to travel essentially over from France. And I think the fact that we put that into focus really misses the much, much bigger picture, the problems that refugees face worldwide. There are many different reasons why people flee their country, as you outlined in the definitions of what a refugee is. A lot of that might be war, a lot of that might be climate, a lot of that is persecution in their home country for various different characteristics that they might have that causes them to not be safe in their country. And those are the real issues that need addressing on a global scale. And the Refugee Convention was part of making sure that those people can be protected in a way that, countries agree of the processes that we can do that through. We could talk about the way that weapons are sold and used across the world by and from different countries, and how that has a direct link to refugees then traveling and coming to different countries. And we can also talk about the state of asylum processes and acceptance rates in other countries, and the living conditions of refugees in, for example, Calais in France, and how the camps are torn up and all the equipment and belongings are taken from people on a very regular basis, and why that might be a reason that people go from one perceivably, quote, safe country to another. There are clear reasons there. And when we look at these problems, quote unquote, in isolation of, the rates of refugees that are coming into the UK, or the deaths that happen for people trying to get here, we forget that we live in a global society, and actually all of these kind of different challenges and circumstances are interlinked, and we should really be having a much broader conversation about what's causing what and where we can really make a change, rather than always just dealing with the kind of the end result. And the bill doesn't tackle any of those things. The bill just makes it harder for people who are already in an unimaginable, difficult circumstance. For whatever reason, they've had to flee their country, and facing barriers to accessing that human right of being given asylum and being accepted as a refugee in the countries that they've gone to before us, because that's the reality. And we're just kind of another door that's trying to close on them. And we're forgetting that this is extremely vulnerable children and adults who may have been through war, may have experienced torture, may have been trafficked. And also, let's not pretend, I think, that the concern here is primarily the deaths that are happening in the channel of people trying to get here. We can see from the way that our government, and as in particular politicians, have spoken about refugees and migrants and all of the other, quote, others, that it seems to be much more about just not wanting to let, quote, them in, rather than about saving lives. Because if it was about saving lives, we'd be trying to make our asylum processes easier, and we'd be trying to create safe routes for people to come here to seek asylum.
In all of this, a lot of what you've said, a lot of those arguments were there in some of the discussion in the House of Lords. And I didn't listen to the House of Commons argument, which I probably should have as well, to get a full view of this. But I think looking at the arguments, they were quoted time and time again. So many NGOs non-governmental organizations have been contacting us, telling us, all these organizations been letting us know what's wrong with this bill. And so that was being mentioned in the Lords time and time again. And one of those organizations which I know has been involved, is Evangelical Alliance. They've come from that argument. Their key things are they're concerned about safe routes, concerned about detention and bail. Their concern is for the support of unaccompanied children, and also the fact that those unaccompanied children could be locked up as part of this process, I think for 72 hours or something like that. And their concerns about how people are being treated and real things like this are all those organizations are writing in and bringing those concerns into the House of Lords and saying, come on, consider this, have some heart, look at this. This isn't going to work. This is a much bigger picture. That's not solving any of these issues that you've mentioned there, Melissa. And I think some of those issues are huge. Our money that we normally give to overseas aid is being used on dealing with asylum seekers here in the UK in hotels. And what a lot of people don't realize is that why are we giving money over there where we've got needs here? Needs is always relative. It's always in some situations, someone might, well, I need a new Mercedes-Benz because I can't afford a Porsche or something. It all works through in different levels in different countries and different settings. But the overseas aid budget has been one of the things that has helped prevent a lot of this migrant moving around the world by putting money into key locations around the world where there's need and helping people. And as a result, if you help people in their local area, if you help prevent war in some of these places, or you don't arm militant groups, all those things help people feel more settled in the situation they're in. There's no need to run across the world. The other thing that really stands out, and I've sort of sat and thought about this, I don't want to get this wrong, I want to get this right. There's a book I read on the undeserving and deserving poor by Natalie Williams and Martin Charlesworth. And the Victorians had this method of saying, these are the deserving poor, they deserve our help. And these are the undeserving poor that don't deserve our help. And they categorized poor people in those two categories. And the undeserving, the undeserving poor were the ones that had alcohol problems or some other thing like that they deserved the poverty they're in. The deserving poor were the ones who actually they could help because they've fallen on hard times or there's something like this. And so by their categorization, they tried to put people in two camps. What we've seen in governments time and time again since that point in Victorian history is they have this old dole bludgers you had with Thatcher. You had these kind of labels people were put on. And actually, some of those are very unfair. And actually, some of them aren't even understanding the issues involved in some of those things. And so as a result, these labels don't help. And I think that's the kind of approach I'm seeing with this, that people are putting a label on people and saying they deserving, they're undeserving, they migrants, they're asylum seekers, and they're illegal and they're legal. And all these categorizations of people that I've looked through the report, read through chunks of it. I haven't read the whole thing because it's huge. But actually in reading through some of those things, you're finding these categories, and it's almost like the assumption you're wrong before you're proved right is the basis for it. Now, I'm just sort of wondering, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable to have that approach into some of the neediest people around. And I find that difficult personally. Yeah, go for it, Melissa.
It's extremely dehumanizing. And the idea of illegal and legal. And I know that in the bill terms, it's talking about the act of migration rather than the person, but we've seen it in the language used around this whole issue. The word illegal is often used about the person. And not only is that wrong to anyone in any circumstance, but when that person is someone who's in such a difficult circumstance, and is so at risk because of what they're coming from and also what they're facing in terms of the challenges to gaining asylum. It's just so wrong. It's so wrong.
Yeah, I think in many ways, I just wonder whether we should work through the key issues raised. I mean, I'm going to use the basis of the Evangelical Alliance one, the safe routes.
Mm-hmm.
Their statement on it is this: without more safe routes for people to claim asylum in the UK, those in need of refuge will continue to risk their lives by making dangerous crossings to the UK. If the government truly want to lessen the number of people making these crossings, they need to create more safe routes to seek asylum in the UK. The few schemes that currently exist, i.e. the UK resettlement scheme, community sponsorship, and the mandate scheme, only allow for people experiencing fear or persecution in a very select number of circumstances and from specific countries, such as Ukraine or Afghanistan, to enter the UK. We'll be asking peers to amend the bill to create clear, safe, and legal paths to seek asylum in the UK for people experiencing persecution across a much wider range of countries. And I think that sounds like a reasonable, sensible suggestion. I don't know what you think, Melissa.
So if we look at the number of actual applications for asylum that are made, just looking here, it's around 75,000 applications were made in 2022. So the total number of applications for people claiming asylum, which was for around 90,000 people. So we're talking about applications having multiple people in the case of families. And if we compare that to, if we contrast that to the year ending in June 2022, 170,000 visas were granted for Ukrainian nationals. So we're looking at around twice as many visas were given to Ukrainian nationals as the total number of asylum claims that were made in a similar year. So this idea that we don't have space, or that migrants aren't going to contribute to society, or that we have a kind of inherent problem with that, it's just clearly untrue, and the figures just don't hold up. And so we definitely can do more. We definitely can do more.
Yeah, I wonder if it's actually by doing more, it's actually, how do you utilize this as a strength? Actually, I've noticed in a lot of things, there is strength in diversity, there's strength in numbers, there's strength in some of these things. And actually, with Brexit and leaving the EU and not having that flow of people across our borders in the same way, isn't it smart to use what's happening with people wanting to move to the UK, actually to do that really, really well? You'd have a strength built into the country. I lived years ago in Australia, and someone in Australia said to me, if Australia doesn't have a certain number of migrants, it begins to die as a country. So they have to have a balance of people coming in. And actually, I thought that was interesting. It shocked me at the time because I hadn't thought of it like that. I thought countries just functioned. But actually, there is something of that life and that flow in and out of a country that has an impact. Expats all over the country bring in income by creating networks with business companies and all sorts of things across the world. So that interlinking is a very powerful dynamic, and I think that's interesting with the current migrants and the issues faced.
And just going back to the making it difficult for people to enter that first issue on the point of the bill, in that people must come from the country that they're fleeing. Essentially, they must come directly from there. But we know that if there are no safe routes facilitated by the UK, then that's going to be impossible, and therefore people's claims, if this bill is accepted, will be automatically rejected and they won't be allowed to appeal. And that kind of links into the second problem of the bill as well, that makes it easier to remove people And that's because of this idea, and I'm getting this information from the Joint Council of the Welfare of Immigrants, their briefing on this bill. Rather than looking at individual case-by-case circumstances and being able to make a decision based on the actual applicant, the bill wants to introduce this idea of there being a general risk associated to particular countries and essentially applications being granted or denied on those bases rather than on the circumstances of the people or the characteristics of the people. And this seems to be a very similar problem that we see in the kind of the numbers discrepancy and the attitude discrepancy with Ukraine versus every other, refugee. It's that we're saying, well, these people we'll allow them in on whichever basis kind of we can put up for debate, and I'm sure we'd have a lot of different opinions. But the bill will kind of solidify that way of thinking, and it will be saying, yes, actually, we can kind of give a blanket yes and a blanket no based on the circumstances of country, but that whether a country is in war or not is not the only reason for someone to be able to claim asylum. So it's just completely unfair.
Yeah, and I think looking at the detention side of things in its current form, and we need to remember that this bill can be adapted and changed as it goes through the House of Lords, but in its current form, the bill allows for children to be detained for up to 72 hours. And, any kind of detention of children is unacceptable and inhumane. I know from other settings that even on criminal grounds, trying to find places for children who've been arrested is very, very difficult. So that's harder to find just in the country, let alone with people crossing and arriving in the country and being detained for 72 hours. Where are those going to be? Are they going to be safe houses run by councils? And if councils are struggling to manage young people and that in that way, it's pretty, I don't know how it's going to work. I think one of the things that came up in the conversation with the House of Lords was that unaccompanied children at the moment, some councils are having to house them in hotels on their own rather than in facilities. And what those young people then do is very vulnerable to organized criminal gangs. It's very vulnerable to a lot of these things. The other real concern in the bill about unaccompanied children was that actually when these children get to 18, so there might be some protections in the bill until they're 18. Once they arrive at 18, they're sent away, kicked out the country. They lose all their rights. And so what's going to happen, they were saying, was a lot of those children, when they get to 17 and a half, will disappear into places, will become untraceable because of the fear of being sent back or the fear of what happens to them. And so there's the thought processes behind this, the kind of the categories that people are put into has very little hope in it. And I think there should be hope rather than a criminalizing of people in this process. So there's a lot that needs to be changed in the bill, in my opinion. I hope some of that will.
Yeah, me too. Sorry, I'm feeling struggling a little bit with just the reality of what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we in the UK we kind of have this very solid idea of anyone under 18 is a child, and therefore we do what we can to protect them, and it's everyone's responsibility to protect them, right? And we should have kind of a really contextual and holistic sort of view of how we're making sure young people are safe. But we know that so many under 18s are travelling alone and seeking asylum in our country. And we definitely aren't doing all we can do to protect them. We're not listening to, we're not fast tracking and listening to their claims and making sure that they are giving refugee status and all of that all that comes with that. And as you said, they're being placed in hotels, which makes them extremely vulnerable. And oftentimes it's being placed in hotels with other adults as well, not just the hotels full of children that we've heard of with children going missing. And that can be with or without kind of age disputes happening for various sort of different circumstances. So it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to talk about. So we can only imagine the actual realities of people that are in these situations.
Yeah. And I think the other side of it, and I think this is the other bit which I think in our discussion we need to mention, is what is the government trying to tackle? And the issue that it seems they're trying to tackle is organized criminal gangs bringing people over and exploiting laws and loopholes in laws. And so this is an attempt to close those, and assuming that will close down organized criminal activity on this subject. And with the knowledge of what happens, any organized criminal activity will find the next way through something. You know, all the efforts by organizations and laws to stop drugs coming into this country doesn't work. And so how is a law or a bill like this going to do that with people and people trafficking when that is happening all over the world and right currently in the UK at the moment? I don't see how this piece of paper is going to manage to stop a lot of that. And I think, in fairness to the government, I can see what they're trying to do, but I think there are other ways of approaching this. And so that's my personal opinion. I think there's other ways to approach that, but there are difficulties they are trying to address. And I think, to be fair to them, not just hit from one side, but actually saying this is trying to address a huge global problem. It's trying to address things in other countries where there's no power to do anything about it. There's a trying to address people making money off this, and horrendous amounts of money, and people using people in this. And so there's attempts to address some of those things, but I think the methods of addressing it may make the problem slightly worse rather than making it better. And I think that's the difficulty. In a way, I'm glad I'm not in government, because I don't think I've got the solutions.
It seems that one part of that solution would definitely be to create more safe routes for people to claim asylum in the UK and in other countries. That would obviously stop a level of human trafficking that happens. It would stop then funding the criminal gangs that you're talking about. That's definitely one thing that needs to happen. And the other side of that is, even if this bill does create a deterrent for people crossing the channel, as we've talked about, even if it does, that doesn't suddenly mean that these people that we're talking about don't exist, that they aren't still in the situations that they're in. They're just stuck somewhere else with the same challenges. So it really doesn't help people at all. It doesn't help people. It doesn't really solve the problems. And as we've talked about in terms of numbers of Ukrainian nationals that were given visas and settled here, it can be done. There is a space, there is the facility to do it. There are just a lot of other issues that need, I suppose, tackling for why it's not happening for other people.
Yeah. And I think that compassion in the heart of it is so important. And when you get to hard things like laws, that often gets thrown out, but needs to be in the heartbeat of the law. I think there's in terms of the law, you've got the law itself, which is words written down, but there's the heart of the law. And I think there's something in the heart of the law that's needed in this, and hopefully will arrive in place in the House of the Lords, as it goes through or doesn't go through. But it's got weight behind it. I think, there's definitely some deep debate going on there. I look forward to hearing the second debate on it that takes place with some of the voting as well. That'll be the interesting stage. But thank you, Melissa. I think we've had a good chat, and yeah, it is that compassion and yeah, talking about this does stir stuff and is very emotive.
Thanks, Nigel.